Hello, my name is Nate Campion, and today I will be talking about The Shining and how, I know, crazy, it isn't really about ghosts, but about how systems like power, gender, history, can all shape people into something potentially violent and abusive. Yeah, I am going to be referencing authors such as Michael Foucault, Judith Butler, Karl Marx, and some critics on their theories. After watching and analyzing the film, it becomes very clear and happens very quickly that the film centers around the idea that less around the idea of just something supernatural occurring, but more about how people can be controlled, constructed, and pushed to collapse by their environments. Yeah. We will be starting with Michael Foucault and his idea that power doesn't just come from authority, it comes from everything and it shapes our behavior entirely. Our environment, culture, media, really anything that we find ourselves surrounded by ends up shaping us in some way, shape, or form. Starting off with the first point of interest within The Shining that represents this idea is the Overlook Hotel. It acts like a system of control. It essentially it rewards obedience in the sense that it wants to push Jack into a sort of violent and aggressive behavioral cycle, and it punishes resistance to this cycle. So it is a very clear and direct metaphor to how intense the shaping of one's, or the cultivation of one's environment can shape them as a person and influence their decision making. The Overlook Hotel, in summary, acts as a force to tear apart the Torrance family and push Jack into a regressed state of violence and lack of self control. So, moving on from Michael Foucault's point of power does not come from authority and how that relates to the environment of which the Overlook Hotel creates, we're now going to be focusing on Judith Butler's idea that gender is something that is constructed through repeated action and is not something inherently known or fixed or stable. Basically, throughout the film, we see Jack represented as this figure of masculinity, and this identity and masculinity begins to erode or be chipped away at as he fails as a writer or as a husband or as a father. And in response to this, in order to prove his masculinity, he falls into the hotel's trap and allows himself to regress and become extremely violent and aggressive again. And this all again plays into the idea that he believes that his gender is a fixed role and has a fixed basis and behavioral stereotype that he must follow in order to maintain his identity, and he does this by acting violent. Wendy, on the other hand, while yes, she is forced by the hotel into a more passive, fearful role, her survival throughout the film shows that despite being assigned to these roles, it doesn't mean that taking actions outside of them are impossible. It's clear that Jack stayed within his role and met his fate as he did, and Wendy was able to diverge from the role that the hotel had given her, and that in turn led to her inevitable survival. So within The Shining, gender is definitely a strong focus, and it shows that it is something unstable and dangerous when taken to extremes, especially within the ideas that society presents to us. Moving on from Judith Butler's idea of how gender is not fixed and can be an unstable concept, we'll be talking about Franz Fanon's idea of how domination, especially violent domination such as colonialism, leaves lasting psychological damage that resurfaces over time and can't really be buried. And on the surface may seem hidden, but creates underlying issues and problems. So the most obvious connection to this within The Shining is that the Overlook Hotel is built on past violence, and that violence is not something that will stay buried or hidden forever. And we see this within the ghosts that continue to reappear within the hotel. That this past violence is now resurfacing, and it's dragging the Torrance family into it, especially Jack, and it drags all of them into it. But the point being is that it uses Jack as this kind of method to restart the cycle, continue the cycle of violence and anger and aggression that the hotel has experienced in the past. And then Jack also becomes a part of this violent history, and this ends up continuing on to the idea that violence and aggression and these things aren't necessarily personal, but can be inherited and influenced due to outside circumstances, such as Franz mentions concerning colonialism and almost like generational acts of violence, such as that, things that aren't going to stay buried and things that will resurface regardless of how much you try to keep them locked away in whatever sense, in whatever form that takes. For my next point, for my next at least connection between the theories we've discussed this semester and The Shining, we will be referencing Edward Said and his idea that dominant cultures create narratives to justify their power. It's pretty straightforward in the terms of the Overlook Hotel represents a Western power and luxury that was built on violence. That's pretty much as straightforward as it can possibly get, but it's also about the underlying ideas that aren't addressed, like possible themes and hints to indigenous erasure within The Shining, based on where the hotel was built, but there aren't any actual like direct scenes that correlate or show this, and that relates to the idea that ideology is something that's hidden and lies underneath within a larger system that isn't usually recognized by those within the system. I think that's one of the great things about The Shining and how many things you can pick apart and dissect from it, is that a lot of them aren't actually there, but are simply suggested or even very lightly referenced in order to convey something larger. I think this creates a great connection with ideology, with the concept of ideology, in the sense that it's there and we know that it's there, but it's really hard to be like actually physically visible. You kind of just have to make those connections based on context and based on like the surrounding environment, and the things you encounter and the things that you experience. Okay, next we will be viewing The Shining from a Marxist perspective, essentially showing how Jack is trapped in a system that defines him by his work and success. This also connects to the point we made earlier about from Judith Butler referring to his masculinity and how that leads to his inevitable breakdown and collapse. When Jack fails to uphold the standard, the societal standard of work and success, it strips away his identity entirely and leaves him seeking to fill that void with something else, which, as we referenced before, would be this violence and aggression. The hotel kind of acts as a space of wealth and isolation, and it reflects a lot of capitalism's contradictions, which is something that Marx would reference in terms of promising, giving the incentive that success is guaranteed here, but also producing a breakdown within the character himself. This does connect to the point that while capitalism, as Marx refers to it as, may appear as like a permanent law, like everlasting structure that we have simply been born into, that it is still something that is very capable of being destroyed and altered. And in this sense, Jack's kind of fall from grace, I guess I wouldn't really call it grace, but Jack's inevitable plunge into more aggressive and toxic behaviors shows kind of the collapse of a system when there are no alternatives left. And he's kind of stuck in this corner where he is failing entirely at the only thing that he can be measured by within the success within the hotel, and therefore resorts to other means to justify his self as a person, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, moving on, we'll be referencing Anna Kornbluh and her idea that modern critique has become too passive, in the sense that people and critics are now focused on observing problems and issues rather than actually making active efforts to change them. The Shining pretty definitively reflects this danger, primarily in the idea that Jack is completely consumed by the system and completely unable to resist it, as we see him succumb very quickly and continuously. But the difference here being is that Wendy and Danny actually act and do something and attempt to escape. And this represents the idea that existing within something and observing is not actually going to solve anything. And if anything, it's just going to allow these problems to fester and grow and eventually consume us. The idea that Wendy and Danny's behavior is what saved them kind of reflects the idea that people within like an ideology or a society who are observing things and not making an effort to change them will ultimately result in losing to them or being overcome by them. Um, Primarily focusing on the idea that um, resisting systems isn't really enough. Like being in a system and resisting it isn't enough, but leaving the system altogether, as represented by Wendy and Danny escaping the Outlook Hotel, would represent Anna's idea of modern criticism becoming too passive and not active enough. In conclusion, the summary of the ideas presented within this presentation go to show that The Shining, as I made sarcastically clear in the beginning, is not about ghosts, but is about systems that shape identity, history, culture, language, identity, all of it, gender, all of it. And the problem lies in not, at least within the film, that no, it's not what haunts the hotel, it's what the people entering the hotel carry with them. And I think this applies to all of us in the sense that we all have taken something from the world outside of us and we carry it with us as, maybe it's not necessarily a negative thing, it doesn't all have to be repressed and horrible, but we all are constructed of the ideas that we're surrounded by to a very powerful extent. And it's important that we recognize those things. And I think The Shining is a great film to push people to do that. Thank you for listening. Again, my name is Nate Campion, and yeah.